Hey, good afternoon. My name is Jed Kensla. I am the Communications Director for AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us on this Zoom press teleconference this afternoon to share results from recent polling that we did on behalf of the Housing is a Human Right, the housing advocacy arm of AIDS Healthcare Foundation, that revealed some surprising results and information that we will be sharing with you. We're going to give it a minute or so before, because I know people have had to register and get a link back. So we will give just a minute or so before we get into the meat of the sharing the results. But I will turn it over to Susie Shannon, who is the Policy Director for Housing is a Human Right, to give broad opening remarks.
Great, thank you so much, Jed. So thank you to everyone who is tuning in and to members of the press who are here with us today. We're very excited to present polling data today on housing and homelessness for the city of Los Angeles. Voters seem very interested in alternative models and practices and how we address homelessness in our city. This includes alternative building models at lower price points like prefab modular housing, basically prioritizing folks who are unhoused with underlying medical conditions, who are physically or mentally ill, living on the streets, as opposed to prioritizing housing for people who are healthy and living in parks, and also providing more affordable housing for a lot of our new construction and builds. It's also rather remarkable, given Judge Carter's injunction, and this poll was conducted prior to the release of his injunction, how his directives and findings line up with a lot of voter sentiment for these ideas. And so we'll be looking at that as well from our pollster, Paul Goodwin, who'll be speaking in just a moment. I do want to say we will be presenting some data on the mayor's race based on prospective candidates. AHF is a nonprofit, so we'll not be extrapolating the data to suggest who should get in or out of the race or predicting outcomes for any future elections like the primary or the general election. And I think if we're ready, Jed, I can move over to Paul Goodwin and the PowerPoint.
Yeah, actually, I just want to say two things. So I will be the contact where I'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. It's not that long a presentation. It's about 10 or so minutes, I believe. But I will be the point of contact, and I will be happy to share the two documents, the top line findings from the Los Angeles voter survey, as well as the point that we will be sharing with you. Some reporters who are on, I've already emailed the documents to. But, and I will reiterate at the end, my email is my name, Jed, Ged.Kensla, Kenslea, which I've misspelled there, I see, at aidshealth.org. I will correct that. Apologies. Okay, and now we can turn to Paul.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to work on this project, the survey with you. If you don't know me, I've been doing polling in Los Angeles for a long time, about 30 years. I'm gulping as I say that. So I've looked at a lot of polls in California and in Los Angeles. And there is, as you're about to see, there is something that's, I think, unique in what we found, and we'll get to that in a second. But we're going to start with views on the homeless situation, homelessness. We'll take an early peek at the mayor's race and also a few other findings that may be of interest. So let's go to the first slide, or second slide. So this is just quickly methodology. As you can see, we did a survey of 500 registered voters from a randomly recruited panel. They self-identified as living in the city of Los Angeles, being registered to vote, and will definitely or probably vote in the election. We did it in English and Spanish, and in the middle of April. So it's been since the 18th, so 10 days or so since we completed the survey. So next slide. So when I said that, all right, that's fine. When I said that there was something unique about the results in the survey, what I meant was specifically the level of intensity in voter reactions to the issue of homelessness. So we read voters this, or they saw, I should say, this list of issues, and they were asked to rate each one as important, or as serious, I should say, or not serious. And then they were divided, they could say very or somewhat serious or not serious. If you look at the 79% who rated homelessness as very important, I have never seen anything quite like this in my years of polling in terms of intensity. Certainly we've seen homelessness as one of the top issues facing the city in recent years, but this level of concern is really something, and I suspect that it will become the dominant issue, the defining issue in the coming race for mayor. You can see that crime, job loss due to the pandemic, and lack of affordable housing are also really high. There's really high levels of concern as well for on these issues, but the intensity is the strongest on homelessness. Next slide, please. So I hope you can all see this. I know it's a lot of numbers, but let me point out what I think is interesting here. So this is breaking out the proportion who said the issue was very serious by racial ethnic groups and homeowners and renters. And these are self-identified homeowners and renters. So you can see Black voters and renters in particular are expressing the highest levels of concern about homelessness, affordable housing, police abuse, and gentrification, certainly for Black voters. You can also see that Latino voters are expressing the highest level of concern about job loss due to the pandemic. So I found those differences interesting, and we can talk about it more later if you have questions. Next slide. Now, 7 out of 10 voters say that homelessness has gotten worse in the last year. There were two differences, one of which I noted here when you look at when you break out results by different types of voters. So renters and homeowners, renters were particularly concerned about it, although 61% of homeowners saying that it's gotten worse in the past year is also is pretty strong. But you see that there's also a partisan split, with 65% of Democrats versus 76% of Republicans and 83% of independents. So there's a pretty sharp partisan divide here, Democrats and non-Democrats on this issue. But again, even among Democrats, 65% say the issue has gotten worse in the past year. Next slide. So as you're going to see, we asked a variety of questions about how voters feel about the unhoused and some policy options addressing the issue. So as you just saw, voters are really urgently concerned about the issue and the growing size of the unhoused population. But as you can see in this slide, many are also more likely to blame larger economic forces over the decisions made by the unhoused for the problem, and to call for more services for them. So if you look at this slide in particular, you can see that over on the left on your screen, that when we presented voters, respondents with these choices, and asked them which is more responsible for the increase in homelessness, or for homelessness, 31% said basically it's the result of decisions that individuals make, actions and decisions. 54% said that it's more the result of rising rents and wages that don't keep up with the cost of living. There is a partisan divide here that you can see very clearly in these slides. So with Democrats, it's more than 2 to 1. we say it's the result of rents and wages over individual decisions. Republicans, it's more or less the reverse of that proportion. Independent voters or NPP voters, somewhat in the middle. You can also see quite an interesting difference between Black and Latino voters and white voters, although certainly a majority of 50% of white voters say it's more about economic conditions. There's also an age difference here, which is interesting. With younger voters, much more likely to attribute the homelessness to economic conditions compared to older voters. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that I think is interesting is asking voters what should be a higher priority for the city. Now remember, this is a pick one, so it doesn't mean that if you picked one, you don't care about the other priority. But if you have to choose a priority, meaning helping the homeless get off the streets with housing and services, or protecting neighborhoods from the impact of homeless encampments, you can see it's more than 2-to-1 overall help the homeless with services. There is a partisan divide here, although even among Republican voters, it's a 10-point edge for a majority for helping the homeless. And Black voters are 84% help the homeless, and a lower proportion of white and Latino voters, but still very strong, and a fairly even split among Asian voters. Next slide, please. So we looked at policies that may be at odds with current city practices, and found that voters support either different practices or new approaches in some cases. So the first thing we looked at is the issue of essentially how to use Measure HHH funds, the housing bond from 2016. So we found that 58% of voters would prefer a more efficient approach to spending the funds, lower cost units, prefab, modular housing. 26% prefer the city's current permanent housing efforts. And I know Susie and Jed can talk about this more later, but I believe that 500,000 per unit is an accurate number, or if anything, an underestimate of what some of these costs have been. Next slide, please. So another issue that has come up in recent weeks or months is who gets the highest, who should have the top priority when it comes to placement in housing for the homeless and temporary housing. Should it be those who are mentally and physically ill and living on the street, or those who are healthy and living in public parks? So, as you might imagine, 64% said it should be those who are mentally and physically ill. 26% said those who are healthy and living in public parks. And I think they will talk about how this varies from the city's current practice, but it's pretty consistent across partisan and ethnic racial lines. Next slide. So we tested a number of policies. It's not surprising that voters support, especially the top 3 items here. What's surprising to me is the level of support. So you would not see this level of support if there wasn't as close to a consensus as you can get that the city needs to act. And as you'll see, some of these really coincide with items that Judge Carter mentioned in his recent ruling. The last 2, I think, are surprised me in how strong the support level was. So we asked, this is basically about developers of new housing setting aside affordable rental units. And we split the sample, so half the people heard of a requirement of 35% set aside and 50%, half heard 50%. So there was relatively little difference. To me, this is really interesting, very strong support for this proposal among voters. Next slide. And one more of these policy issues that we looked at. Should we have more services for existing encampments, such as healthcare, trash pickup, and toilets? 84% yes, only 12% oppose this idea. And this crosses partisan lines, all lines here. If you know, this is a real clarion call to the city from voters. Next slide. I'll let you peruse this if you download the PowerPoint yourself. But these are quotes from Judge Carter, and where it aligns with some of the results of our survey. Okay, next slide. So we're going to look at, it's an early look at the race for mayor, right? So obviously the field of candidates is not yet set. As you're going to see, we picked 6 candidates who seem likely to run or rumored to be running when we wrote the poll in early April. Next slide. So Kevin and Mark Ridley Thomas have a small lead. Obviously, a large plurality of voters are undecided. This is, of course, before any money's been spent, before endorsements, before the field's been set. What I find more interesting than the actual, relative order of the results is that that Kevin has 31% support from Latinos, who are about 28% of the respondents in the survey. Mark has 27% of support from Black voters, which is about 9% of likely voters. So as we start this process, if they are in the race, they're on their way to consolidating a base, which is interesting, with white voters splitting fairly evenly across the candidates. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about two-way races? What about, matchups of the candidates one-on-one? So we did 4 of these. You can see that Kevin has a 10 to 16 point lead in each of the 3 matchups we tested with him. This is driven by taking, depending on the matchup, 54 to 62% of the Latino vote. He also has a 5 to 7 point lead over his opponents among white voters. Black voters in the matchup with KDL are supporting Mark by 2 to 1. But again, you have close to 40% who are undecided across each of the two-way matchups. Last couple of slides. So you can, next slide, please. So we're going to show you some remarkably, well, I shouldn't say remarkably, we're going to show you some high favorable ratings for the mayor and for AHF. So next slide. I shouldn't have said remarkable because, every poll that I have done in the city of LA since Mayor Garcetti was elected in 2013 show high levels of either approval or, in this case, name ID, favorable, unfavorable. And this poll is no exception. So despite all the crises of the past year, other than with Republicans, he remains very popular. And even with Republicans, he's almost breaking even in his name ID. What is perhaps more remarkable to me is that even among the 70% who said that homelessness is getting worse, he's at 61% favorable, almost 2 to 1 favorable to unfavorable. There's not really much difference by race or ethnicity. You can see he's a little more popular among women than men. I believe that's been common in the past. And of course, Democrats are his base, and that's the majority of voters in the city. Final slide. So we did a name ID, no other information, just AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and 74% favorable. So when I asked Susie about this earlier, apparently this is comparable to earlier polls that they've done. So this is nothing new. So it continues, AHF continues to be a very highly regarded institution by LA voters. Okay, so I think we're going to take questions now.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Thanks for that comprehensive presentation. First up, Susie, did you want to have any remarks before we open it up to the questions, or shall we just answer in progress? Okay. Participants can raise their hand, and Arturo, who is our tech maven, will unmute and open up the lines. I have actually sent the documents to a couple of the reporters that I was able to identify in our attendee group. I'm happy to send to others as well. So questions, comments? While we may be waiting, I would share one thing that I thought was significant or noteworthy was the large majority of voters polled who supported requiring developers to set aside far more units than they currently do, 35% or 50% of new housing units. You know, we are using 20th century approaches to a 21st century problem here, I think. I just think of the College Station project downtown adjacent to Chinatown that is a 720 unit 725 unit project that I believe Planning Commission was recommending 5% or 37 units be made affordable. City Council at that time in March of 2019 overrode the Planning Council's decision to require absolutely no affordable housing in that particular project. And if I recall correctly, I believe that was because the then council member argued that his district had met the threshold of the required build, completely ignoring the problem that that we have. So I was really heartened on that particular result. We do have a question. Okay, it's to get the document so I can handle that offline for Judson, Buddy Sampson. I will get those for you. Susie, any comments while we also are?
Well, I just want to thank everyone again for tuning in, and we will be obviously getting this poll out fairly wide. I do want to point out, because there were some things that we didn't actually mention outright, but there's also support, which we've seen in Judge Carter's directives and findings, and also from this poll, large support for using our government-owned vacant lots for housing, and continuing the conversion of motels for housing for our unhoused community. And I think that has been like in the media on and off, whether or not we should continue, and the city kind of going back and forth on that. But there is a very strong support for that among Los Angeles voters. And I would say too, the results on having a more compassionate approach for our unhoused community, I think is very important, especially as our city looks at adopting policies in the next few months. I think that is significant, and I'm hopeful that will be helpful for our policymakers in terms of making decisions as we're moving forward. Cool. There aren't any questions, I think, and the Zoom call.
Sure. And again, if you do have further questions, you may reach me either via email, jed.kensler, GED.kensler, KENSLEA@aidshealth.org, AIDSHEALTH.org, and my cell phone is 323-791-5526. Again, 323-791-5526. I'd like to thank Paul and Goodwin Simon Research, Strategic Research, Susie Shannon, and also Arturo Castro for handling our technical component here today. Again, any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for those who did join us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Paul.